On the evening of October 12, 1951, Prague's central station carried the same smell it always did: coal smoke, damp stone, and the faint tang of iron from the tracks. Yet beneath the ordinary clamor of luggage being dragged, shoes tapping on marble, and the sharp whistles of porters, there was an unease that hung heavy in the air. It was the kind of unease that had seeped into the city since the communist regime tightened its grip, when whispers traveled faster than trains, when neighbors avoided each other's eyes, when the night seemed full of ears. At platform 9, a train weighted its carriages, stretching long and heavy into the darkness like a sleeping steel serpent. To the casual observer, it was just another night departure, train 407, bound for Bratislava, scheduled to stop in Berun, Plzeň, Rokycany, and a handful of small towns along the way. Steam hissed from its valves, the lamps glowed dimly through the fog, and the conductor's boots clicked against the platform as he paced. It looked routine, ordinary, and yet years later, survivors who stood on that platform swore they had felt something different, as if the station itself knew this would not be an ordinary journey. The passengers were a mixture of the anonymous and the known, though in time they would all be reduced to whispers. Professor Anton Krall, the historian who had spoken too boldly about the regime's rewriting of Czech history, clutched a battered leather satchel to his chest. Marta Novakova, the once famous singer now reduced to silence for refusing to perform at government rallies, hid her weary face behind sunglasses and a scarf. Near the rear carriage, a group of young men huddled together, their eyes darting nervously. Rumor would later claim they intended to slip across the border into Austria under cover of the train's route. Mixed among them were mothers and children, workers with suitcases tied shut with string, a retired conductor still carrying his pocket watch as if clinging to the past. 42 passengers, according to the manifest, 42 lives about to vanish into smoke. At precisely 10:15 p.m., Joseph Richter, the stocky conductor with a stern face, blew his whistle. He carried sealed orders from the Ministry of State Security inside his jacket, though no one knew this then. Families waved from the platform, scarves and handkerchiefs fluttering. The engine groaned, wheels clanged, and slowly train 407 pulled itself free from Prague station into the autumn night. Its whistle cut through the city like a cry, echoing far longer than seemed natural, mournful and sharp enough to raise gooseflesh. For a time, everything appeared normal. Guards saluted at Berun as the train roared past. A mechanic in Plzeň recalled the red glow of the lanterns as the carriages disappeared into the darkness. Signalmen along the route ticked their logs, marking the train's passage. Then after midnight, as it approached the Svata Anna tunnel near Rokycany, the record ends. The train entered the mouth of the mountain, black smoke trailing against the pale moon, and it did not come out. On the far side, operators waited for its lights. They waited a minute, then 5, then 20. The night stretched on, empty and still. By dawn, alarm rippled quietly through the railway network. Train 47 had disappeared between 2 points less than 3 kilometers apart. No wreckage was found, no bodies, no twisted rails. By morning, rumors clung to Prague like fog. The newspapers controlled by the regime printed nothing. The radio said nothing. But in trams and market stalls, in whispers carried from one apartment stairwell to the next, the story spread. An entire train had vanished. Some swore it was a derailment the government was covering up. Others muttered of sabotage, of spies, of political prisoners hidden among the passengers. A few, lowering their voices to barely a breath, spoke of something stranger, that the tunnel was cursed, that it swallowed steel and souls alike, that if you walked near it at night, you could still hear screams echoing from the stone. The Ministry of State Security issued a single line: Train 407 experienced a technical fault
Investigations are ongoing. Families who came to ask about their loved ones were met with silence or menace. One widow recalled how two plainclothes officers arrived at her apartment. Forget him, they told her, for your children's sake. She never asked again. Years later, researchers would discover the manifest itself had been tampered with. Some names were missing, replaced by generic labels like worker or traveler. One name appeared added in a different hand, almost as an afterthought. Major Victor Horak, seat 12 in the first carriage.
No one remembered seeing him bored. No one could say why his name was there. For the farmer who lived on the ridge outside Plzeň, the night would never be forgotten. He woke at midnight to the sound of steel wheels rattling the earth, saw the plume of smoke against the moonlight as the train curved toward the mountains. He swore it slowed as it neared the tunnel, as though resisting the darkness. He waited for the sound of it emerging on the far side, waited until his breath grew white in the cold air. Nothing came. It was as if the earth had swallowed it whole. He told his wife the next morning, and so the legend of the train of no return was born not in newspapers or speeches, but in the frightened whispers of a city that already knew too well how easily people could vanish. October 12th, 1951 became a date that families carried like a scar, the night when steel and steam disappeared into darkness and never came back. The last sightings. The night air outside Rokikani was sharp thin, the kind that made a man's breath sting his throat. At 12:30 a.m., station operator Karel Benesh leaned on the rail outside his booth lantern in hand and squinted at the horizon. He expected the familiar glow of train 407's headlamp to slice through the fog any moment. The schedule said it should have cleared the Svata Anna tunnel by now. His logbook open to the blank line, awaiting the entry sat on the desk behind him. But the horizon remained empty. He rubbed his eyes, muttered to himself, and listened. No whistle, no rumble of steel, just silence. The last confirmed sighting had come from Plzeň, 15 kilometers back at 11:58 p.m. The signalman there, a meticulous man named František, noted the time carefully in his ledger, just as he always did.
He swore later that the train's lights seemed strangely dim, as if the carriages themselves were pulling shadows along with them. He remembered lifting his lantern to wave at the passing conductor, but saw only a blur of movement inside the cab. No return wave, no human acknowledgement. Near Zadice, an old track worker claimed to have seen something even stranger. He described a flickering glow around the train, a sort of pale halo like heat shimmering above asphalt in the summer. The carriages looked as though they weren't quite solid, he muttered years later, long after drink had loosened his tongue. Like they were there and not there both at once. His wife told him to stop speaking nonsense, and he never repeated it publicly. But in hushed corners of taverns, he was known as the man who had watched the ghost train. The final and most contested account came from a shepherd near Rokikani.
He had brought his flock down from the hills when he heard the metallic shriek of brakes echoing across the valley. Looking up, he swore he saw the train slowing before the mouth of the Svata Anna tunnel. He described passengers pressed against windows, pale faces wide with alarm, some even pounding fists on the glass as if trying to escape. Then, without sound, the carriages rolled into the darkness. The shepherd waited, his sheep restless at his side, but the train never came out. Investigators from the Ministry of State Security questioned him the next morning. He told them what he had seen, voice trembling, and for his honesty, he was branded a liar. His neighbors whispered that he had been warned never to speak of it again. Within weeks, he had moved his flock far from the tunnel's shadow. The authorities, of course, produced their own version of events. According to the official report, thin, heavily redacted, and marked classified, the last reliable sighting of Train 407 was at Paulsen. After that, the record simply stopped. No entry at Rokikani, no confirmation from the tunnel operator, no mechanical alerts from the track, as though the train had ceased to exist in the space between two dots on a map. The strange detail that troubled even loyal party men was this: the signals inside the tunnel had recorded nothing, no heat, no vibration, no presence of steel wheels against rail. The logbooks showed a gap, a silence, and in rail systems, silence was the rarest and most terrifying sign of all. Meanwhile, families who had waved goodbye at Prague Central began arriving at stations along the route. They asked after their loved ones, husbands, sisters, children, and were met with blank stares. No such train arrived here, station masters told them, parroting instructions from higher up.
One mother fainted on the platform when she was told there was no record of her son's name in the manifest, though she herself had watched him board with a ticket clutched in his hand. Another woman brought a luggage receipt to prove her husband's suitcase had been stowed in the cargo hold. The clerk tore it in half and told her to forget she had ever been there. Despite the silence, fragments of truth survived. A janitor in Plzeň recalled sweeping the station floor that night and finding a child's toy train near the track, an object he was sure had not been there earlier. In Rokikani, a baker claimed she had been woken by the sound of screams carried on the wind around 12:45 a.m. It was like a crowd, she told her daughter decades later, but thin, distant, like voices dragged through water. In the village nearest the tunnel, dogs barked wildly that night, refusing to settle until dawn. By week's end, the ministry ordered all discussion of Train 407 forbidden. Railway staff who had logged its passage were pressured to erase entries or alter them. One station master simply drew a black line through the entire page, explaining later in a whisper, "They told me it was safer to have no record at all." And yet memory cannot be erased so easily. Passengers' families kept their own lists written in secret, hidden under mattresses and inside flour sacks. Among them, one name kept appearing: a man no one seemed to recognize, Major Victor Horak. Who he was, why he had been aboard, and why his presence appeared only in later versions of the manifest became one of the enduring mysteries of the case. The official narrative declared the passengers never existed, but in kitchens and back rooms, in the clatter of dishes, and the whispers of mothers rocking infants to sleep, the truth lived on. Dozens had seen the train, dozens had watched it vanish, dozens had heard its echoes in the night. The last sightings of Train 407 were like smoke in the wind, visible to many, impossible to capture. And as the days turned to weeks, one question pressed harder than any other: how could something so large, so loud, so heavy with life vanish into thin air? The sealed tunnel. By the third day after Train 407 vanished, the Suata Ana tunnel had become the heart of the mystery. Men in gray uniforms stood at its mouth, rifles slung over their shoulders, while heavy trucks idled nearby, their exhaust curling into the damp mountain air. The villagers who lived along the ridge watched from a distance, clutching their coats against the October chill. They had seen soldiers and officials swarm the site before, but never with such urgency, never with such secrecy. Something had happened inside that tunnel, something that frightened even the men who pretended not to fear anything. The official explanation was that the tunnel was unsafe.
Engineers arrived with clipboards and hard hats, muttering about unstable rock formations, faulty ventilation, the need for temporary closure. Yet the villagers who had passed through that tunnel their entire lives knew better. The Svata Ana tunnel had stood solid since the Austro-Hungarian days, carved deep into stone, its walls thick and unyielding. Trains had thundered through it without incident for decades. To them, this sudden concern was not safety, it was fear. On October 15th, a team of workers erected barriers across both ends. Heavy iron gates clanged shut, and a fresh coat of black paint was slapped across them, as if to erase the memory of the train that had entered only nights before. A wooden sign was nailed into place: restricted zone, no entry. Soldiers paced back and forth, barking at anyone who lingered too long. The tunnel, once a vital artery of commerce and travel, was now a wound sealed under iron. But sealing the tunnel did not seal the whispers. Farmers told stories of hearing voices echo from within, long after the work crews had left for the day. Some said the wind carried the sound of wheels grinding against rails, followed by a whistle that rose and fell like a cry for help. One man who lived close enough to see the gates from his window swore he had seen faint lights flickering behind the bars as though lanterns swung in the darkness. His wife begged him to stop watching, to stop talking, but he could not look away. The most chilling account came from a young boy who wandered too close. He claimed that when he pressed his ear against the gate, he heard people inside whispering his name. His father dragged him away, shouting that he was lying, but the boy cried for days afterward, insisting it had been real. Meanwhile, inside the government offices in Prague, the Ministry of State Security scrambled to control the narrative.
They knew closing the tunnel would draw questions, but their greater fear was that someone might discover what really lay within. Files were sealed, manifests, altered testimonies shredded. Railway officials who asked too many questions were quietly reassigned or dismissed, and always the party's newspapers spoke only of minor technical difficulties, a phrase repeated so often it became a bitter joke among workers. Yet fragments of the truth leaked through the cracks. One of the engineers assigned to inspect the tunnel, a man named Emil de Vozak, returned home pale and trembling. He told his wife that he would never set foot near Svata Anna again. When she pressed him, he muttered something about scratches on the stone deep as claws and the smell of smoke, though no fire burned. A week later, he was found drowned in the river, ruled an accident by the authorities. His wife never believed it. The tunnel's closure created practical chaos.
Trains were rerouted across longer, slower lines, frustrating commuters and freight operators, but no one dared complain too loudly. Everyone knew what the ministry was capable of. Better to grumble in private, better to pretend that the sealed gates were just another inconvenience in a life already full of them. Still, memory lingers. Old men in rocky canny taverns raised their mugs and swore they would never walk past the tunnel again. Children dared each other to creep close to touch the cold metal gates and run away before a soldier spotted them. Women lit candles on their windowsills at night, praying for those who had vanished, even if they never spoke the prayers aloud. Decades later, when the regime finally collapsed, investigators returned to the tunnel, pried open the rusted gates, and stepped into the damp, musty darkness. What they found there was not wreckage, no twisted steel, no shattered glass, no bones, only rails that ended abruptly 10 meters in as though the track itself had been swallowed. And on the stone wall where the rails stopped, faint, scorched marks spread upward like the fingers of a hand reaching for escape. For the people of Czechoslovakia in 1951, the sealed tunnel became more than just a closed passage. It was a symbol of erasure, of how easily lives could be swallowed by darkness and silence. They called it a scar in the mountain, a scar in their history. And every time someone passed by those gates, they asked themselves the same question, silently, fearfully. If a train could vanish into thin air, What chance did any one of them have of being remembered? Warren, The Vanishing Records. The Ministry of State Security building in Prague was a labyrinth of stone corridors and heavy oak doors, each guarded by the hush of secrets. Within its archives, thousands of files were kept under lock, and key reports on border crossings, intercepted letters, dossiers on suspected dissidents. It was here that the records of Train 407 should have been preserved, lists of passengers' schedules, maintenance reports, the official investigation logs. But when clerk Josef Hruby descended into the records room one morning in late October, he found only empty shelves. The section labeled Railway Incidents 1951 was bare. The ledgers, carefully maintained for years, had been stripped away. At first, he assumed it was misfiling some careless junior officer moving files without authorization. But when he asked his supervisor, the man's expression tightened. "There are no such files," the supervisor said curtly. "You must be mistaken." His tone carried the weight of finality, the kind that told Joseph never to raise the matter again. Yet Joseph could not let it go. He had processed the train's manifest himself. He remembered the names businessmen from Prague, a group of students, a woman traveling with two young children. He had stamped their entries into the ledger with his own hand, and now it was as if they had never existed. Over the next week, more anomalies surfaced. Telegraph messages between stations, once stored on reels of tape, disappeared from their cabinets. Accident reports submitted by railway officials were recalled, retyped, and returned with whole sections missing. Even the train's maintenance log, the record of every inspection, every repair, was scrubbed clean, its last entries carefully whited out. It was not mere negligence, it was erasure. Outside, the ministry whispers spread among railway workers. One man said he had been called in to testify about the train, only to find his statement rewritten in language he did not use. Another claimed that his colleague, who had spoken too freely about what he heard that night, was transferred east without warning and never returned. The fear grew thicker than the October fog. The most damning discovery came from a young journalist named Karel Benesh. He had been following the story quietly, gathering notes for an article he dared not publish. Through a contact at the railway, he obtained a carbon copy of the original passenger list. But when he compared it against the official manifest, now held in the archives, nearly half the names were missing. Entire families had vanished from the record as though they had never boarded. Carroll hid the copy inside a hollowed-out dictionary on his bookshelf. He told no one, not even his wife, where he kept it. He knew too well what happened to those who tried to expose the truth. Still, the knowledge weighed on him like lead.
Each night he heard the faint sound of a train whistle drifting across the city, though no trains ran past his street. He began to wonder if the ghosts of Train 407 were calling to him, demanding he not let their memory be erased. Meanwhile, inside the ministry, the cover-up deepened. An internal directive stamped with the red seal of the party ordered that all references to the October 10th incident shall be removed from official circulation. Any surviving fragments, letters from relatives, ticket stubs, even casual mentions in station logs were to be confiscated and destroyed. One officer who had served long enough to know better than to ask questions remarked bitterly, "It's easier to erase paper than to erase grief." He was right. Families of the missing continued to petition for answers. Mothers lined the railway office steps, clutching photographs of sons who had never returned. Widows wrote letters that vanished into the maw of bureaucracy. A few were given vague explanations: accident, transfer, classified military matter. Most received nothing at all. By December, the silence was almost complete. It was as if the train had never run, its passengers never lived. But history has a way of resisting obliteration. In small cracks of the system, truth lingered, a ticket stub pressed between the pages of a book, a railway worker's diary entry smudged with coal dust, the whispered recollections of a soldier who had stood guard outside the sealed tunnel and never slept the same afterward. And so, though the party tried to bury the truth in locked cabinets and shredded paper, the story of Train 407 persisted not in the official records, but in the haunted memories of those who had seen enough to know something monstrous had happened. Years later, when archivists revisited the ministry's files after the Velvet Revolution, they found entire folders missing their absence, noted only by blank spaces in the catalog.
On some surviving forms, faint impressions of erased words could still be seen under ultraviolet light, names, dates, phrases hastily blotted out, but not wholly destroyed. And in the margins of one heavily redacted report, a clerk had scrawled a single sentence in pencil, almost too faint to read, "You cannot erase what the mountains remember." Echoes of the passengers. The disappearance of Train 407 left behind more than a void it left. Echoes, whispers of lives, suddenly cut off fragments of memories, clinging stubbornly to the world that had lost them. In Prague, a seamstress named Clara Havel returned to the station every day for months, staring at the bulletin board, as if a single notice might bring her husband back. He had boarded the train with a satchel of cloth samples, bound for Vienna, and she still wound his broken pocket watch each night, convinced she could hear his footsteps outside her door.
In Brno, a schoolteacher received her brother's suitcase delivered weeks later without explanation. The latches were broken, the tags scratched off, and the clothes inside were damp and musty, as if they had been hidden underground. Tucked into his jacket pocket was a dining receipt stamped October 10th, the night the train vanished. In Bratislava, two children waited every evening by the window for their mother to return, the same mother whose photograph had been confiscated by gray coated officials who insisted she was never on that train. The children swore they still heard her lullabies in the silence of the house. The land itself seemed to echo their absence. Shepherds in mountain villages spoke of hearing a train at midnight, its wheels screeching and hissing with steam, though no trains had run there in years. Some claimed they saw lanterns moving in the fog, drifting like restless souls along the rail line. An old woman insisted she had spoken to passengers wandering through the snow, confused their faces, pale, and their clothing decades out of fashion. She had pointed them toward the station, but they turned away into the mist and vanished. The villagers dismissed her tale as madness, but children grew afraid of the path where the tracks disappeared into the mountains. In smoky basements across Prague, students and dissidents whispered about Train 407 transforming its disappearance into something more than tragedy. They called it the train that carried truth away. To them, the passengers had become martyrs, not only to whatever horror had consumed them, but to the system that insisted on erasing them. Pamphlets appeared in secret bearing the names of suspected passengers. Among them was Dr. Ludwig Novak, a physicist rumored to have opposed the party's nuclear ambitions. His absence was no coincidence, the pamphlets declared. The train's fate was not an accident, but a silencing.
Authorities struck back, tearing down posters, arresting students who dared speak the names aloud, but still the whispers spread. The more the regime tried to silence them, the louder the echoes seemed to grow. One of the clearest voices to survive came from a battered notebook smuggled out of the sealed tunnel by a railway worker. It belonged to Marta Kralova, who had boarded the train with her two children. The early entries were ordinary descriptions of crowded compartments, the smell of coal, her children's chatter, but the last pages trembled with fear. We have stopped. The conductor says it is a delay, but I hear men shouting in German. My children are frightened. The lights flicker. The words grew frantic. It is cold, too cold. They are telling us to stay seated. Soldiers outside. Why soldiers? The final line scratched across the page in a trembling hand read the doors are locked. After that, nothing.
The notebook itself was later seized during a ministry sweep, but copies of those last pages circulated in secret, preserved like relics of a voice that had refused to vanish entirely. Even within the system, some hearts defied orders. Clerks and archivists tasked with erasing the train's existence hid duplicates of the passenger lists in drawers and cupboards. Some circled names with red ink, whispering them like prayers. When asked why he risked so much, one archivist answered simply because they are still out there somewhere, and the dead deserve to be remembered. By the mid 1950s, the echoes of Train 407 had grown into something the regime could no longer contain. Families still demanded answers. Villagers told stories of ghostly trains in the mist. Students sang songs of the lost, and investigators, with remnants of conscience, kept scraps of evidence alive. The silence imposed by the state had begun to fracture.
The voices of the vanished had not faded. They had multiplied, haunting every corner of the land, pressing against the walls of secrecy. And in the pressure of those echoes, the machinery of silence began at last to tremble. The whispering walls. The tunnel at Davinska Kobila was more than a scar in the mountain. It was a wound that refused to close. Officially, it had been sealed after the war, too unstable, too unsafe for further use. Yet locals whispered of strange noises inside of air that seemed colder near the stone mouth, and of a dampness that clung to the skin like an invisible hand. They called it the place where the voices live. Even in daylight, children dared each other to approach, but few lasted more than a few steps before fleeing from the sense that someone or something was watching. It was here that a railway worker named Joseph Martinek found himself one stormy night in 1952 carrying only a lantern and the memory of a promise he had made to a widow who had lost her husband on train 407. The state had warned him never to approach the tunnel, but Joseph had grown tired of silence. For years he had overseen the rail lines, checking bolts and sleepers oiling the tracks. But every time he passed the sealed entrance, he felt the weight of the lost pressing against him. On that night, as thunder shook the hills and rain ran in rivulets down the stone, he placed his ear against the cold wall. What he heard was not the wind, it was the muffled rhythm of wheels, faint and metallic, rolling somewhere beyond the barricade. When he pulled away, his heart pounded so loudly he feared it would draw attention, but the tunnel was deserted and the sound had stopped.
He stumbled back down the embankment, lantern swaying, convinced that the mountain itself was haunted by the train's ghost. He told no one at first, fearing ridicule or worse arrest, yet the whispers gnawed at him until he finally confided in a friend, a fellow worker who had once lost a cousin on the vanished train. That man listened in silence, then nodded grimly and said, "You've heard what I have heard." Word spread in secret. Soon there was a quiet ritual among railwaymen. Every few months, one of them would make the walk to the tunnel and place an ear against the wall. Many claimed they heard nothing but the cold silence of stone. Others swore they heard voices crying out as if trapped between rock and air. A few reported hearing music, an orchestra faint, distorted like the echo of a gramophone, swallowed by distance. One man emerged pale and trembling, saying he had heard a woman singing lullabies in German and that the sound had followed him for hours afterward.
The authorities noticed the gatherings. They tightened patrols, warned the workers against superstition, and even spread rumors that the tunnel was full of poisonous gas to frighten off the curious. But the stories continued. Families of the lost began leaving flowers near the entrance despite the risk of being labeled agitators. Old women lit candles, and some even claimed to see flickering lights, inside moving as if carried by unseen hands. The ministry tried to snuff out the rituals by walling the tunnel even higher, covering the mouth with concrete slabs and barbed wire. Yet the persistence of memory was stronger than stone. The whispers were not confined to the mountain. In apartments across Prague, families spoke of hearing knocks on their walls. At night, 3 raps in quick succession, the signal their missing loved ones used to give when returning home late. A widow swore she heard her husband's voice outside her door, calling her name. When she opened it, the hallway was empty, but the air smelled faintly of coal smoke. A child woke crying, insisting that her father had visited her room, dressed in his traveling coat, his face pale, but his eyes full of sorrow. The girl's relatives hushed her, quickly, terrified that neighbors might hear and report them. By 1954, the phenomenon had become so widespread that even party officials began whispering about it. Some dismissed it as hysteria, the collective grief of a population already burdened by shortages and fear. Others feared it was more a contagion of memory that could not be controlled by censorship. The train had vanished, yes, but its passengers were still among them, seeping through cracks in silence, inhabiting walls, tunnels, and dreams. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these accounts represented true paranormal events or were simply the natural result of trauma amplified by state repression. One archivist who dared to keep hidden files on the case recorded dozens of testimonies. In his notebook, he wrote, "It is as if the vanished were pressing against reality, demanding recognition. Not gone, not yet gone." He collected descriptions of voices of footsteps heard in corridors, of faces glimpsed in mirrors. One striking testimony came from a railway engineer's wife who claimed that while hanging laundry, she looked up to see an entire carriage reflected in her window, passengers staring silently at her before the image dissolved into nothing. The state, faced with growing unrest, tried to co-opt the whispers. Propaganda leaflets began to circulate, claiming that the train had been destroyed by foreign saboteurs and that the voices heard were evidence of Western plots to sow confusion, but the people did not believe.
They knew the truth was closer to home, that the train had been taken by forces within their own borders, hidden away for reasons no one dared articulate aloud, and so the whispers became a kind of quiet rebellion. To speak of them was dangerous, yet to ignore them felt like betrayal. Families taught their children to remember names, to whisper them at night like prayers. Marta Ludwig Janek Josephina. A generation grew up haunted not only by what had been done, but by the unrelenting presence of those who refused to be erased. One night, a group of students ventured into the mountains with candles and notebooks, determined to record what they heard at the tunnel. They stayed until dawn, scribbling down every creak, every gust, every strange vibration. Most of what they captured was ordinary, the shifting of stone, the drip of water. But on one page, the words stood out in trembling script. Voices chanting, sound of a train whistle, children crying.
When they returned, they were arrested within days. Their notes were confiscated, their families interrogated, and yet copies survived, passed hand to hand, folded into coat linings, hidden inside loaves of bread. Every time the authorities tried to suffocate the memory, it spread like smoke through cracks in the walls. The whispers could not be silenced because they were not only the echoes of the vanished passengers, they were the voices of the living refusing to forget. They were a reminder that truth, once buried, seeps upward like water, wearing down even the strongest stone. And in the darkness of the tunnel, where the concrete slabs pressed tight, where the echoes of wheels and voices lingered, the mountain seemed to agree. The walls whispered still. The Pact of Shadows. The further the years stretched from October 1950, the stranger the bonds became between those touched by the disappearance of Train 407.
It was no longer just families clinging to hope. It was railwaymen, archivists, students, even priests, an underground fellowship of memory, bound together by the belief that the vanished had not gone quietly into darkness. They called themselves many things in whispers: the circle, the witnesses, the listeners, but in truth, they were simply people who could no longer endure the silence demanded of them. Their meetings began in kitchens, cellars, and candlelit chapels, always beneath the cover of night. They carried fragments of passenger scarf, a letter never delivered, a railway timetable smudged with coal dust. One man would swear he had heard footsteps in his stairwell. Another would tell of a dream where a familiar face pressed against glass. A woman recited the names of her entire carriage as though speaking them, kept her husband and children alive in some liminal place. Each fragment was small, fragile, but together they formed a tapestry of resistance against enforced forgetting. In 1955, when the state tightened its grip even further, executing reformers, erasing dissenters, the circle made a pact. They gathered in an abandoned chapel near Žilina, its roof half collapsed, its altar covered in dust. Rain leaked through the rafters, dripping onto cracked pews. There by candlelight, they swore that none of them would allow Train 407 to vanish from history. If the government refused to acknowledge it, they would preserve it. If the walls whispered, they would listen. And if truth demanded sacrifice, they would accept it. The pact was sealed not with signatures, but with relics. Each member placed something of value upon the altar: a railwayman's brass whistle, a widow's locket, a teacher's ink pen, a child's ribbon.
These items, ordinary in life, became extraordinary in secrecy, tokens of remembrance buried in a tin box and hidden beneath the chapel floor. They believed that by binding themselves together in this way, they were also binding themselves to the lost souls of the passengers. But secrecy came at a cost. Members lived in constant fear of infiltration, for the Ministry of State Security had eyes everywhere. One clerk who smuggled passenger lists into the circle was arrested weeks later, accused of spreading foreign propaganda. His name was struck from the records, his family evicted, his neighbors forbidden to speak of him. Within the circle, his absence became a wound, but also a grim confirmation. The closer they came to truth, the greater the danger. Still, the pact held. Whispers turned into action. Some members began copying old railway records by hand, hiding them inside hymnals and cookbooks.
Others mapped the sealed tunnel, sketching lines and corridors that matched no official diagrams. One daring member, a university student named Pavel, claimed to have discovered a secondary access shaft disguised as a ventilation duct. He swore he heard voices below, echoing faintly upward like air drawn through a flute. No one dared descend, but the possibility was enough to fan the fire of belief. Outside the circle, the world twisted into silence. State newspapers published fabricated reports the train never existed, or it was destroyed by Western terrorists, or it was nothing more than rumor. Families were instructed to move on. But how does one move on when footsteps still echo in stairwells, when lullabies linger in the walls? The regime underestimated grief. They thought memory was a flame that could be extinguished. They had forgotten that even the smallest flame, hidden in the hollow of a hand, could grow into a blaze. The circle's whispers spread in ways that no police file could track. A priest wove the names of passengers into his sermons, disguised as biblical genealogies. A violinist composed a piece that ended with the screech of a train whistle played in concert halls where the audience wept in silence. A bookseller slipped pamphlets into the bindings of novels so that when a reader reached the middle, the story paused and gave way to the names of the vanished. These were acts of rebellion, cloaked in artistry, memory hidden within culture. And then came the night of the pact renewed. 10 years after the disappearance, the surviving members of the circle returned to the chapel. They were fewer now, some had died, some had been taken, but those who remained gathered again by candlelight. Their relics had tarnished and decayed, but they unearthed them and placed them once more upon the altar.
The railway whistle was cracked, the ribbon frayed, the locket dulled, but to them these imperfections only deepened their power. As the rain drummed on the roof, they repeated their vow, but this time one of them added words that unsettled even the bravest. If the living cannot bring justice, then let the dead take it. A silence fell over the group, for it was one thing to remember, another to invite vengeance. Yet no one contradicted him. They had all heard the whispers. They all knew that the walls of the tunnel were restless. From that night onward, stories darkened. Railway workers began disappearing, men who had once guarded the tunnel or overseen its ceiling. Their absences were never acknowledged. Files were quietly closed, families quietly silenced. But among the circle, suspicion grew that it was not the state erasing these men, it was something older, something answering their pact, as if the lost passengers had chosen their own messengers of retribution. Investigators and historians are still debating whether this escalation was the circles doing vengeful men and women lashing out in grief, or whether the accounts of ghostly vengeance had some deeper root. What is undeniable is that the years following the pact saw a rise in unexplained deaths and vanishings, tied, however faintly, to those involved with the train's erasure. For the circle, this was both terrifying and exhilarating. They had bound themselves not only to one another, but to the restless truth itself. They were no longer just witnesses. They had become participants in something larger, darker, and unstoppable. And so the whispers in the walls grew louder, and the pact of shadows, once sealed in secrecy, became something far more dangerous, a covenant, not just between the living, but between the living and the dead. Blood on the Snow. The winter of 1960 struck hard across the Carpathians.
The mountains groaned beneath ice, rivers froze in silence, and villages vanished beneath snowdrifts that turned roads into winding tombs of white. To most, it was simply another cruel season in Eastern Europe, one that demanded endurance and hunger in equal measure. But to the circle, the fellowship bound by Train 407's memory this winter was remembered for something else entirely, for it was then that the whispers of vengeance ceased to be whispers and became visible, undeniable acts written in crimson against the snow. It began with the death of Anton Weiss, a mid ranking railway inspector who in 1950 had overseen the sealing of the tunnel where Train 407 had disappeared. Officially, he had retired quietly, living in a small stone house near Košice, but neighbors spoke of his unease, how he paced at night, muttered about footsteps outside his window, and refused to ride any train after dark. When he was found sprawled in his garden one morning, blood soaking into the fresh snow, the police were quick to declare it a robbery gone wrong. Yet no valuables were missing. Instead, the only thing left behind was a small scrap of paper pinned to his coat, a fragment of a passenger list from Train 407. Word spread swiftly, though always in secret, for the families of the vanished Anton's death was not tragedy, it was justice. To the circle, it was proof the pact of shadows was no mere metaphor. The lost were speaking. The whispers in the walls had teeth. Weeks later, another figure fell. This time it was a man named Richter, a bureaucrat in Bratislava who had authored the order to destroy original railway manifests. He was found in his office long after midnight, slumped across his desk, his face pale and eyes wide. There were no wounds, no sign of struggle, only his typewriter sat before him with a sheet of paper rolled inside.
The keys had struck a single repeated word over and over: listen. The circle read these events as messages. The state, however, dismissed them as coincidence, or worse, as sabotage by reactionaries. Yet fear spread even within the regime's ranks. Officials once eager to erase Train 407 grew reluctant, their voices faltering in meetings, their pens trembling as they signed false reports. For the first time, it seemed that silence carried a cost. Snow blanketed the country, muting sound, yet the circle's gatherings grew more fevered. They met in barns and crypts, their breath visible in the frozen air, their candles flickering against the frost. Pavel, the student who had once claimed to hear voices in the ventilation shaft, argued that the circle no longer needed to seek justice through human hands. The dead are answering, he said. We are not alone in this. They are moving through us. Others disagreed. Helena Kralova, the widow, whose entire family had been aboard Train 407, warned against surrendering to vengeance. We swore to preserve memory. She said not to summon monsters. Yet her words, though heartfelt, faltered against the tide of fervor that was sweeping the group. Too many had seen the patterns. Too many believed that the blood in the snow was no accident. And then came the blizzard night. Near Poprad, it was January, the coldest on record. A freight train laden with coal had stalled on the line, its crew huddled in the engine for warmth. They reported hearing knocking along the cars as though fists pounded from within the sealed cargo holds. One man opened the door to investigate and swore he saw faces pressed against the coal, pale and gasping before they vanished in a shower of dust. Terrified, the crew abandoned the train and fled to the nearest station. By dawn, the cars were found empty, but in the snow alongside the tracks lay dozens of footprints, bare human, leading into the forest where no one was ever found. The ministry sealed the report. The crew disappeared into interrogation cells, but fragments of the tale leaked into the circle, and with them came a new conviction: the lost passengers were no longer confined to whispers or tunnels. They were moving restless, stepping into the living world with each crack of ice and drift of snow. February brought the most brutal sign yet. In a village near Žilina, the local party secretary, a man known to have mocked grieving families and threatened anyone who spoke of the train, was discovered frozen upright in the town square. His body was rigid, eyes wide open, one hand raised as if clawing at the air. Around him, carved into the snow by some unseen hand, were dozens of names, the names of passengers. Witnesses swore the letters glowed faintly in the moonlight before fading at dawn. The circle gathered that night, shaken to their core. No one denied it now. Their pact had become something alive, something that moved through storm and silence. The question was no longer whether justice would come, but whether they had unleashed a force they could not control. Helena spoke again, her voice trembling. If this is justice, it is justice without mercy. Are we not becoming like those we despise? But Pavel countered her with fervor. No, this is balance. This is the weight of silence finally breaking. Divisions tore through the circle. Some wanted to harness the phenomenon, to feed it with names, to direct its vengeance toward every official complicit in the cover-up. Others feared they were sliding into something darker than the regime itself. Yet despite their arguments, they all continued to meet bound by the pact, unable to look away from the unfolding storm of retribution. outside their circle, the world remained outwardly unchanged. Newspapers reported accidents, robberies, unfortunate cases of frostbite. Yet beneath these lies, an unspoken truth was spreading. The train had not gone quietly. The passengers were still among them, moving like shadows through the snow, demanding to be heard. And so the winter of 1960 ended not with relief, but with dread. For when the thaw came, villagers reported that the melting snow revealed stains that no sun could fade, dark crimson patches where no bodies had been found, and everywhere along walls, bridges, and doors appeared faint outlines of handprints as if pressed from the other side of reality. The circle, once merely guardians of memory, now found themselves the keepers of something much more dangerous, a covenant written in blood upon the snow. The net tightens. The winter thaw came slow, as if reluctant to surrender its grip on the mountains. Snow melted into rivulets that cut through the frozen soil, carrying with it the stains of a season that had unsettled even the most hardened officials. Villagers whispered of red streaks running in the meltwater and of names still etched faintly on walls where no hand had touched. For the circle, these signs were not illusions, they were confirmations. Yet confirmation was a double-edged sword, and with every story spreading through hushed tavern corners and market stalls, the weight of attention grew heavier. The state which had once dismissed the circle as grieving eccentrics began to turn its gaze more sharply upon them. The Ministry of State Security, with its faceless men and endless files, declared the incidents of winter to be sabotage orchestrated by reactionary groups. They could not name the group outright nor prove its existence, but the circle's clandestine gatherings had left traces: too many candlelit meetings in barns, too many questions asked in archives, too many loose tongues in the wake of fear. By March 1960, surveillance thickened like a net drawing tighter. Families of the vanished noticed plainclothes men lingering by their doors. Pavel reported footsteps following him through the streets of Bratislava, even when snow no longer masked their sound. Helena found her letters intercepted, the seals broken, then clumsily resealed as if she would not notice. The circle felt the pressure not only from the dead, but now from the living as well, two forces closing in, each demanding silence or surrender. The regime sought to explain the strange deaths with rational convenience. Weiss, they said, had been killed by vagrants. Richter's Listen was retyped by pranksters. The Frozen Party secretary was written off as a victim of exposure after a drunken night. Yet the fear in their voices betrayed the truth. They did not believe their own words. Meetings of the circle grew smaller, tighter, and tenser. Some members stopped coming altogether, either too frightened of the secret police or of the shadows they now believed walked beside them.
Others grew reckless. A young man named Marek began scrawling the numbers 407 onto walls in chalk, claiming it was a call to the lost passengers. He was arrested within days, never seen again. Helena, who once urged restraint, now found herself torn. Each night she lit a candle by her window and whispered her family's names. At times she thought she heard a faint knock against the glass, as if someone stood outside in the dark asking to be let in. She wanted to believe it was them reaching across the divide, but part of her feared it was something else, something feeding on grief, wearing familiar voices like masks. Meanwhile, Pavel's fervor burned hotter. He spoke of justice unfolding, of the need to guide the vengeance. In a ruined church one evening, he laid out a list of names: railway officials, party bureaucrats, police inspectors. If we name them, he said, the dead will hear. The snow listened. The walls listened. Now it is time to direct them. But Helena slammed her fist on the table. This is not ours to command. You would use the dead as weapons. Do you not see what that makes us? Their argument cut through the damp silence of the church, echoing against stone walls like gunfire. Some sided with Pavel, their eyes gleaming with anger and desperation. Others clung to Helena's warning. The circle, once united by grief, was fracturing under the weight of power it had never asked for. Outside their quarrels, the ministry tightened its grip. Entire neighborhoods near Koshice and Žilina were questioned about superstitious gatherings. People disappeared in the night, dossiers thickened on desks, and still, in spite of the surveillance, more deaths came. A railway overseer in Prague was found hanging from an iron hook in his office. His tongue blackened his shoes, placed neatly by the door.
A policeman in Trenčín collapsed in the street, clutching his chest, and when his coat was unbuttoned, a folded ticket for train 407 slipped out. Though no one had ever seen it printed, the circle understood the pattern. Even if no one dared to say it aloud, the dead were no longer bound to snow or tunnels. They were reaching farther crossing cities, slipping into bureaucratic offices and crowded stations. Justice, or something that looked like it was no longer localized. It was spreading, and with its spread, paranoia infected the regime. Meetings of the ministry grew frantic. Officials who had once been confident barked at one another, their voices breaking with fear. Some begged for exorcisms. Others demanded mass arrests. Rumors swirled of a faction within the party itself, whispering that perhaps silence had been a mistake, that maybe the truth of Train 407 should have been acknowledged, if only to keep the dead still. For the circle, however, the tightening net was more immediate. Informants had infiltrated their ranks. This much became clear when one of their barns was raided, their candle stubs and passenger lists scattered across the snow as men in leather coats dragged members away. Helena barely escaped fleeing into the forest with nothing but her notebook of names. In the weeks that followed, the circle was forced deeper underground. They no longer gathered openly, no longer lit candles in windows. Instead, they left cryptic marks in alleys, scratches on doors, folded slips of paper tucked into cracks in church walls. They spoke in codes, sometimes not even daring to speak at all. And yet, even as the state tried to crush them, the signs of the dead multiplied. Children spoke of hearing trains at night where no tracks ran. Dogs refused to pass under certain bridges. Farmers woke to find their fields crisscrossed by lines, like rails pressed into the earth.
The dead were moving, and with each step, the circle's purpose blurred further. Were they guardians of memory or conspirators in vengeance? Were they resisting the regime, or being used by something older, darker, that now wore the vanished passengers like a cloak? Helena asked herself these questions as she huddled in a cellar in Bratislava, the notebook clutched in her hands. Its pages were filled not only with the names of the vanished, but with scribbles she could not recall, writing phrases that appeared in the margins overnight, always the same: listen, we are here. The state's net tightened around them. Friends vanished into cells. Rumors whispered that Pavel himself had been captured, though others swore he still moved among shadows, whispering names into the snow. And through it all, one certainty remained: the story of Train 407 was no longer confined to the past. It was unfolding in the present, its echoes louder, its grip firmer, its demand inescapable. The circle had lit a flame in the dark, and now both the living and the dead were drawn to it. The net was closing not only around them, but around everyone who had once thought silence was safety. For in the silence, the lost had found their voices, and those voices would not be contained. The trap, the circle, had never trusted the city, but by the spring of 1960, It was the only place left to hide. Forest clearings and barns had become too dangerous. The ministry combed the countryside with ruthless efficiency, dragging in anyone who so much as lit a candle at the wrong hour. In Bratislava's twisting alleys and cellars, anonymity was easier, though it came with new dangers: informants, neighbors with twitching curtains, policemen who knew the sound of every lock. Helena knew they were being watched.
She felt it in the way a shadow lingered too long behind her as she crossed the tram tracks, in the rhythm of boots that stopped when she stopped, in the hiss of a phone line that clicked when she whispered names to those she still trusted. Still, she could not stop. The notebook burned hotter in her hands than ever before. It was during one of those tense evenings, huddled in the cellar of an abandoned printing press, that she and the remnants of the circle heard of the trap. A friend of a friend, no one knew his real name, arrived with frost still clinging to his coat. He claimed to have overheard officials in a ministry safe house the state planned to bait the circle with archival revelations. Supposedly, a set of passenger manifests from Train 407 had resurfaced buried deep in a forgotten railway archive. The documents were to be transferred under guard across the city. The circle sat in silence, the damp pressing close. Marek's absence hung heavy. Whispers said he'd been executed in secret. Pavel's name drifted like smoke. Some swore he'd been captured, others that he had become more phantom than man, slipping between police lines, as though the dead sheltered him. Helena's hand tightened on the notebook. Passenger manifests, if they existed, might confirm the names she clutched so desperately, might prove to the world that 407 had not been a mere rumor, but flesh and blood. But her instinct churned. If it is bait, what then that night? The circle argued. Some believed they had to act. If it's a trap, so what? We spring it said, Jana's voice sharp. We've been hunted long enough. Better to confront the wolf than wait in the dark. Others shook their heads, convinced it was madness. Helena said little, though her silence carried weight. She thought of the whispers in her notebook, of the words, "Listen, we are here." She thought of her mother's laugh, her brother's questions, her father's rough hands, ghosts she could almost feel against her cheek. If there was truth to be seized, could she risk turning away? In the end, the circle agreed. They would attempt it, not because they trusted the bait, but because the dead seemed to demand it. The night of the transfer was moonless, the sky heavy with cloud. Streets glistened with damp, reflecting the jaundiced glow of street lamps. The circle split into pairs, shadows sliding through alleys, nerves taut as violin strings. They positioned themselves near the old industrial quarter, where the truck carrying the supposed archive was said to pass. Helena crouched with Jan behind a stack of rusted barrels. Her breath misted in the air, her fingers dug into the spine of her notebook. Hours crawled by. Each sound sharpened distant footsteps, the groan of a tram, the drip of water from an eave. And then it came.
A lorry, unmarked, rolling slow along the cobblestones. Two black cars flanked it, their windows dark. Figures inside, smoked, the glow of cigarettes faintly visible. The circle moved. A signal, two knocks against metal, rippled through the alleys. Jan slipped ahead with wire cutters. Another member dropped, nails across the street behind them. Hearts hammered. As the truck neared, Helena felt the air grow heavy, almost electric. From the notebook pressed against her chest came a faint warmth, as though the pages themselves responded. She whispered under her breath, "Are you here?" The truck slowed as nails crunched beneath its tires. A shadow darted across the street. Shouts erupted. A circle member hurled a stone, shattering a car's window. Within seconds, chaos bloomed, boots striking pavement, fists, raised whistles piercing the night. Helena ran forward, her coat flaring. She reached the back of the lorry as Jan forced the lock with shaking hands. Metal groaned. Inside crates, stacked high, stenciled with railway symbols. Her pulse roared in her ears. She tore one open paper, spilled yellowed brittle, manifests, lists of names. For a heartbeat, she believed. She saw Weiss scrawled in faded ink, saw familiar surnames, saw proof. Tears burned her eyes, but then she noticed the dates, the handwriting, the inconsistencies. Many were copies forged clumsily, some with names misspelled, others with identical signatures across different sheets. The bait, shouts grew louder. A flare burst in the sky, flooding the alley with harsh light. Helena's stomach dropped. They were surrounded men in dark coats, closing in from every side, their boots pounding like drums. The circle had sprung the trap. Jan cursed, grabbing her arm. We have to go now. Papers flew as they scrambled. Members scattered like birds, some dragged down by rough hands, others vanishing into smoke.
Helena clutched only one sheet jammed into her coat pocket as she sprinted down an alley. Behind her, gunshots, cracked whistles screamed, and a woman's cry was cut short. She did not stop until her lungs seared. She ducked into a doorway, pressing flat against the cold wood. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. In her pocket, the stolen sheet crinkled. She pulled it out with trembling hands. There, amid the blurred type and clumsy forgery, one name stood out, written not in ink, but in something darker, smeared, almost burned into the page. It was her brother's name, and beside it, a single word in shaky script: listen. Her breath caught. This was no forgery. This was no ministry trick. This was them, the dead reaching even into bait, twisting it, turning it into a message. Yet around her, the circle had been torn apart. Jan was gone, half their number captured. The ministry would claim victory. The trap had closed. But Helena understood something. Now even traps could be turned.
The circle's blood would stain the streets, their whispers silenced by cells. But the dead were no longer bound. They spoke through paper, through snow, through walls. The ministry could set 1,000 snares, but the passengers of train 407 were already loose. And Helena, clutching the page to her chest, whispered into the night, "I hear you." Munich, on Edge, Munich, 1961. The city wore winter like a mask of stone. Snow clung to gutters and railings, thickening in alleys where the sun never reached. Tram lines glistened, and breath hung in the air like smoke from half-extinguished fires. For most life trudged on in rhythm, with the cold markets opening at dawn. Children bundled in wool rushing to school, men carrying brief cases through the broad avenues rebuilt after the war. Yet beneath the surface, tension hummed like an exposed wire.
People whispered about spies, about dossiers smuggled westward, about shadows from the east stretching into Bavaria. Helena stepped off the train at Hauptbahnhof and felt it immediately, the weight of eyes, not the crude stomping surveillance of the ministry she had known in Bratislava, but something subtler. Munich had perfected discretion. A man folding a newspaper too slowly, a woman in a fur coat who always seemed to be standing near the ticket counters, a cab driver whose gaze lingered a fraction longer in the rearview mirror. She carried little with her. The battered notebook was pressed against her ribs beneath 3 layers of clothing. In her coat pocket lay the single page, torn from the ministry's trap, her brother's name, etched in burned letters, the word "listen" beside it. Every time she touched the paper, her hand tingled as if from static. The circle, what remained of it, had scattered. Jan had not reappeared after the raid. Others were surely dead or silenced. Helena herself had crossed into West Germany with forged papers and the help of sympathizers who asked no questions. Now she was alone in Munich, searching for allies she was not certain existed. Rumors had drawn her here. whispers of a man in the city who had worked on the railway manifests before the war, an archivist who had seen train 407 pass through Silesia and vanish into the dark. His name was barely spoken aloud and never written down, but the fragments all pointed toward Munich. The first night she spent in a boarding house on Schillerstrasse, the kind that smelled of boiled cabbage and coal dust. The proprietor, an old woman with cataract eyes, asked no questions as long as Helena paid in cash. She kept to herself, wandering the streets by day, watching the city's rhythm by night. The notebook grew restless. She could feel it when she opened it in the lamplight of her narrow room, the faint warmth of the pages, the margins smudged with whispers. Sometimes the ink seemed to shift when she looked away, letters curling like smoke. On her third night, she wrote a question in the margin, "Where do I find him?" The page remained still, but in the morning when she opened it again, a faint scrawl had appeared beneath her words. "Old stones, bells, seek the tower." She shivered. Munich had many churches, many bells. Which tower might? It was in the Marienplatz that she felt the first real pull. Crowds gathered as the glockenspiel chimed figures in the clock tower turning their wooden dance. Helena stood among them, her gloved hands tight around her notebook. Something in the tolling seemed to vibrate against her chest. The tower loomed over her carved stone and shadow.
And then she saw him, a man in his 60s scarf pulled tight, carrying a leather satchel that sagged with paper. His face was lined, the eyes quick and nervous. He lingered at the edge of the square, watching the crowd instead of the spectacle. For one moment his gaze brushed hers. Recognition flickered not of her, but of the things she carried. He turned away, slipping into a side street. Helena followed, through winding alleys, past cafes, spilling warmth and smoke into darker quarters where few tourists strayed. The man walked with the practiced rhythm of someone used to losing tails. Twice she almost lost him. Finally, he ducked into a small antiquarian bookshop, wedged between two crumbling facades. Inside, dust hung in the air. Shelves leaned with the weight of forgotten tomes. A brass lamp glowed on the counter, illuminating the man as he set down his satchel. When he saw Helena enter, he froze. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, voice graveled by cigarettes.
"They followed you." "No," Helena said, though her heart thundered. "You saw me. You knew." His eyes darted to her coat. "The notebook." She hesitated, then pulled it free. The man exhaled sharply, as if bracing for a blow. He beckoned her deeper into the shop, pulling close the heavy curtain at the back. "My name is Adler," he said at last. "Once long ago, I catalogued trains, manifest schedules, all the paper the Reich demanded, and once in the winter of '44, I saw a train listed that never arrived where it should have." Helena's throat tightened. 407. He nodded, eyes clouded. "You've carried them with you all this time, haven't you? The passengers." She opened the notebook. Pages fluttered, though no wind stirred. Adler flinched but leaned closer. The whispers filled the cramped room low as breath against glass. "God help us," Adler whispered. "They've never left." That night, Adler told her more. How the train had been diverted off the main line into a tunnel near the Silesian border. How his superior, drunk one evening, had muttered about a special order, a shipment never to be spoken of again. Adler had copied the record for himself, but years later, the paper had vanished, seized in a purge of archives. He alone remembered the number, the way the ink had been smudged, as if even the page resisted holding it. They tried to erase it, Adler said, not just the people, But the event itself, the records, the tracks, the names swallowed whole. But history doesn't erase so cleanly, it stains. Helena pressed the torn sheet into his hand. Then why this from a ministry trap? But it's real. My brother's name. And this word, Adler stared at it for a long time because they want to be found. You carry them, Fräulein. You've become their voice. Outside church bells tolled midnight.
The sound reverberated through the stone walls, and Helena swore she heard another layer beneath the chime, faint cries, the echo of wheels grinding steel. Adler's gaze hardened. If you truly mean to follow this, you must be ready. Munich is not safe. East and West both hunt such truths, and if you uncover the full story, he trailed off. It will consume you. Helena met his eyes. It already has. But the city had already begun to close in. The next morning, a black car idled near the boarding house. Two men smoked inside their faces, hidden by the fogged windshield. At the market, she noticed the same woman in the fur coat trailing behind her twice. At night, the phone in her room rang once, then clicked dead. Munich was on edge, and now Helena was at its center. Adler urged caution, insisting they move the notebook to a safer place. But Helena clutched it tighter. The voices were louder now, the pages glowing faintly in the candlelight. Sometimes when she closed her eyes, she saw not Munich, but snowbound tracks stretching into blackness. She smelled coal smoke. She heard faintly the sound of locked doors slamming shut. The dead were restless, the city trembled, and somewhere beneath the surface, something vast was shifting, waiting to break loose. Munich had become a stage, and Helena understood with a cold clarity the next act would be written in blood. A city of shadows, Munich wore shadows differently than Bratislava. Here they were softer layered among neon signs and rebuilt facades, hiding in the spaces between cafes and theaters where the post war world pretended to have moved on. But Helena felt them everywhere, pressing close as she crossed Karlsplatz. At dusk, the fountains frozen in crystalline stillness. The city hummed with prosperity, with tourists and businessmen, and the laughter of students. Yet beneath that surface ran a deeper current, a whisper that she had carried with her from the East. The notebook pulsed against her chest. Sometimes she felt as though it was the one guiding her steps, now tugging her through streets where cobblestones gleamed wet under street lamps, past doorways where strangers lingered just a moment too long. She had learned not to glance back too often. Munich was full of eyes. Adler had urged her to stay hidden. The city isn't safe, he'd warned. They're watching both of us now. But Helena knew hiding was no longer possible. The trap in Bratislava had scattered the circle, left her with only one page of truth and 1,000 questions. If Munich was to be her stage, then she would step into its light, no matter how brief. It began with the posters. One morning, as she walked along Zendingerstrasse, she saw a new flyer pasted crookedly on a wall. Do you remember Train 407? We do. Come and listen. No name, no place, only a time midnight, 2 nights hence. The words were handwritten, the ink smudged as if in haste. Helena's breath caught. No one in Munich should know that number, not unless they were connected to her, to Adler, or to the restless dead. By evening, the posters were gone, torn down, painted over, replaced with advertisements for theater plays and new cinema releases. But Helena had memorized the details. That night, she confronted Adler in the bookshop. He swore he hadn't written them. Someone else knows, he muttered, pacing. And if they know, then so do the ones who hunt us. This isn't an invitation, Helena. It's a snare. Like Bratislava, she asked bitterly. He stopped, met her gaze. Worse. Here the hunters wear many faces.
Ministry men, Western intelligence, even those who survived the war but cannot bear its ghosts. Everyone wants control of the story. And you, he gestured at the notebook, you are the fuse. The night of the meeting, Helena went anyway. The address deciphered from the scribbled flyer led her to the Englischer Garten. Snow muffled the paths, and the river ran black beneath thin ice. Midnight bells tolled faintly from the city beyond. She waited near a wooden bridge, the notebook warm in her hands. A figure appeared, a young woman in a gray coat scarf, pulled tight, face pale in the moonlight. She carried no lantern, no weapon, only a slip of paper. You came, the woman said. Her accent was local Bavarian. Who are you? Helena asked. The woman hesitated, then pressed the paper into Helena's hands. It was brittle, torn from a larger ledger. Names filled the lines, passenger names with numbers beside them. Her eyes widened as she scanned the list. It matched the style of the manifest she had seen in the lorry. But these names were different, realer, consistent. I found this in the state archive, the woman whispered, hidden in a folder, mislabeled as agricultural transport. They didn't catch it yet. I thought someone else should see. Why me? The woman's eyes flicked toward Helena's coat, as if she could sense the notebook beneath, because they whisper to you too. Don't they, at night when it's quiet? Helena froze. Before she could reply, voices broke the silence, boots crunching snow flashlights sweeping across the trees. The woman's face drained of color. They followed me. Helena grabbed her arm. Together, they ran, snow spraying beneath their boots, breath ragged in the cold. Light flared behind them, whistles shrilled. They darted across the bridge into thicker woods. Helena's lungs burned, but she didn't let go of the stranger until they reached the edge of the park, where tram lines cut the night open with their metallic gleam. They collapsed against a wall, gasping. The woman pressed the manifest page back into Helena's hands. Keep it. I can't. They'll find me. Then come with me, Helena urged, but the woman shook her head, eyes wide with fear. No, they already know my face. If I vanish, it will mean nothing. You carry them. You have to keep going. Before Helena could argue, the woman slipped into the shadows, vanishing into the night as the bells of Munich struck one. The next days blurred with tension. Helena studied the new page under Adler's lamp. Unlike the forgeries, this list bore the weight of truth. She recognized some of the surnames from whispers in her notebook, faint echoes that aligned with the ink. Whoever the woman had been, she had uncovered a piece of the buried whole.
But now the city bristled with suspicion. Plainclothes men haunted the market's eyes, scanning every passerby. Rumors spread of arrests in Schwabing, of informants turning neighbors over to the police. Adler grew grim. Munich is becoming a labyrinth, he said. Every alley a trap. We are surrounded, Helena. Yet the notebook pulsed stronger. At night, she no longer dreamed of faces, but of the city itself. Munich's streets unfolding like veins, shadows gathering at its heart. The dead were restless, pulling her towards something. It came to a head one evening as she crossed Odeonsplatz. Snow drifted through the square, muffling the sounds of traffic. She felt it before she saw it. The air charged the notebook burning against her chest. Then the church bells rang, not the clear chime of the city's cathedrals, but something beneath it, a resonance deep and mournful, like wheels grinding on distant rails.
People around her didn't react, continuing their walks, laughing, buying roasted chestnuts from a cart. Only Helena froze, every nerve alive. The sound was for her alone. The notebook slipped open in her hands. across its blank page. Letters scratched themselves in frantic haste. The city is a tomb. The walls remember. She staggered back, nearly colliding with a passerby. Adler's words returned history stains. Munich was not simply a city of spies and informants. It was another layer of the labyrinth, another cage built over the silence of the dead. Helena looked around at the floodlit facades, the statues, the arches rebuilt from rubble. A city reborn, but beneath its stones, beneath its carefully scrubbed history, lay something darker. The whispers swelled, nearly drowning her thoughts. She clutched the notebook to her chest, her breath fogging the icy air. Munich was not just watching her. Munich itself had become a witness.
That night, she could not sleep. From her window in the boarding house, she saw the city's rooftops glimmer under the snow, a patchwork of light and shadow. Somewhere in those streets prowled the Hunter's Ministry men, intelligence agents, survivors twisted into silence. Somewhere in the city's bones echoed the truth of Train 407, and Helena understood with sudden clarity. The game was no longer only about survival. Munich itself was part of the story, now a city of shadows, holding its breath, waiting for someone to tear open its silence. She whispered into the notebook, "I hear you. I will not stop." The pages stirred. Dust drifted through the lamplight like ash, and the city outside seemed to whisper back. The broken circle Munich's nights were never silent anymore. Sirens cut through the air like knives, cars prowled the boulevards long after midnight, and shadows grew restless in the corners of Helena's vision. The circles scattered since Bratislava had become a rumor, even to itself. Some whispered that survivors had made it west. Others swore betrayals had hollowed it out from within. But in Munich, the circle resurfaced, ragged, fractured, distrustful. It began with a coded note slipped beneath Adler's bookshop door. The handwriting was uneven, the paper creased with dirt and cold. The circle waits. Schleißheim Palace. Midnight. Bring the book. Helena stared at it for a long time. The circle waits. Were there truly any of them left? Or was this another net, strung by unseen hands? Adler's face betrayed nothing as he read it. If there are survivors, he said carefully, then Munich is their last refuge. But if it is a trick, he let the thought trail off. Helena touched the notebook, its familiar weight grounding her. "We have to go."
Sa. The palace was half a ruin scarred from the bombings of 15 years before. Snow dusted its broken arches moonlight, painting the grounds in silver. Inside, the air smelled of damp stone and burnt wood. Helena and Adler crept through the halls, flashlights low, their footsteps echoing like whispers of the past. They found them in the ballroom, 3 figures hunched around a lantern. Jan was not among them, nor Pavel. These were strangers to Helena, yet they wore the air of hunted men, gaunt faces, twitching hands, eyes darting toward every shadow. One, a woman with a scar splitting her lip, lifted her head. "You came," she murmured. "We weren't sure anyone still carried the book." Helena held it closer. "The circle is broken," she said quietly, "but not gone." The scarred woman nodded. "Not gone, never gone." But she gestured at the 2 others. "We are few, too few. The rest are ash." Adler's voice was sharp. "Why call us here? Why risk exposure?" The woman's gaze flickered to Helena's notebook. "Because of them," she whispered, "we hear them too. At night in the walls, they want us to finish what we began. Mam naru." They talked until dawn, the lantern guttering. The fragments of the circle told their stories. Raids survived. Comrades lost whispers that led them to safe houses, only to find them burned. The ministry's reach had grown, their hands stretching even into Munich. Yet still the survivors gathered like moths, drawn to Helena's flame. But the reunion was brittle. Beneath their words lay suspicion. Was Adler a spy? Was Helena too reckless? Were these three even truly circle or infiltrators wearing old names? The air between them thickened until finally Helena snapped the notebook open. The pages flared with sudden heat. Words scrawled themselves across the margins, jagged and urgent. Broken does not mean dead. The train waits. Silence fell.
They all saw ink appearing in real time, burning across the page. The scarred woman's lips parted in awe. One of the men crossed himself. Adler only closed his eyes, jaw tight. The train waits, Helena whispered. It's not finished. For the first time, she felt something like hope stir. But hope can splinter faster than it forms. Days later, Helena returned to the bookshop to find the door ajar. Inside, shelves were overturned, books torn, lamps shattered. The air smelled of smoke. Adler was gone. Panic clamped her chest. She tore through the wreckage, calling his name, but only silence answered. On the counter lay a single sheet of paper, the circle's cipher written in Adler's hand. Trust no one. The circle is cracked. Her stomach dropped. That night, whispers in the notebook were louder than ever, overlapping until she could barely breathe.
Faces flickered in the glass panes, her brother, her mother, strangers, whose eyes seemed to bore into hers. They all mouthed the same word: listen. Munich shifted around her in those days. No longer a city, but a labyrinth of betrayals. She met the scarred woman once more, in the ruins near Königsplatz. The woman's face was tight with fear. Adler has been taken, she hissed, or he has betrayed us. I don't know which, but the ministry is close. They've turned someone inside the circle. It is breaking, Helena. Do you understand broken from within? Helena wanted to deny it, but she felt it already: the paranoia, the fractured trust, the sudden silences when names were spoken. The circle was devouring itself. Still she held the notebook, and still it whispered. One night it wrote in letters so bold the ink bled through the page: trust the broken. Even broken circles are still whole. Helena stared until tears blurred her vision. What did it mean? The answer came not from the living, but from the dead. She was crossing the Isar River when she heard it, the sound of wheels grinding against rails, though no train ran at that hour. The bridge shuddered faintly beneath her boots. She clutched the notebook, and the voices rose. We are here. Even broken, we are with you. For a moment she saw them, an endless line of passengers moving across the water shadows etched against the snow. Families, soldiers, children, her brother among them. They did not look at her, but they were not gone. The circle was broken, but the passengers remained. The realization struck her with painful clarity. The circle had always been fragile mortal prey to betrayal and death, but the truth it sought was carried by the dead themselves. The circle could fracture, collapse, disappear into history, and still the truth would endure.
The train itself was the circle, now endless, unbroken. Munich hummed around her as she stood on the bridge, the city lights flickering across the water. She felt no safer, no less hunted, but something inside her steadied. Even broken, the circle's purpose was not lost. She whispered into the night, I hear you. I will carry it even alone. The wind rose, scattering snow like ash, and from the darkness came the faintest reply, never alone.
The betrayal. Munich in winter was a city of glass and smoke lights shimmering in windows, snow melting black against tram rails, breath fogging in the air like secrets unspoken. To Helena, every corner now carried danger. She had seen too many doors kicked in, too many whispers and in silence. And yet, what gnawed at her most was not the ministry's shadows, but the possibility that betrayal was already inside the circle. Adler's absence was a wound that refused to close.
The wrecked bookshop, the cipher note, the circle is cracked. She had replayed those words in her mind until they carved themselves into her skull. Had he written them in warning or confession? The scarred woman met her in the back of a disused café near Sendlinger Tor. Curtains were drawn tight, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee and damp wood. Her hands trembled as she lit a cigarette. "They've taken Adler," she said flatly. Helena stiffened. "You're certain they moved him 3 nights ago? Witnesses saw him escorted to a ministry safe house on Rosenheimer Strasse." Her voice dropped, but whether he was dragged there or walked in willingly, I don't know. The words cut sharper than she intended. Helena wanted to defend him, to argue that Adler would never betray them, but doubt had been growing like mold in her chest. Adler had always been careful, pragmatic, even cold. What if caution had slipped into collaboration? What about the others? Helena asked. The woman exhaled smoke toward the window, watching it curl like a phantom. Gone, scattered, some were caught, some disappeared. The circle is not a circle anymore. It's splinters. Helena's fingers tightened around the notebook. Its pages whispered faintly as though trying to soothe her rage. Brahma. The breaking point came days later. A coded message arrived in the old cipher, but the pattern was wrong. Too neat, too polished. Adler's hand. It summoned her to a warehouse by the railway yards, promising final evidence of train 407's passengers. Helena stared at it under lamplight, her gut tightening. The words on the page blurred until the ink seemed to swim. Finally, she opened the notebook, pressing her hand flat against it. Ink bled across the margins, sudden and sharp. "Trust the dead, not the living." Her throat just closed. Still she went.
The warehouse loomed like a carcass of steel and glass, its roof sagging windows boarded. Snow had drifted against its doors. Inside, her footsteps echoed against concrete floors, mingling with the faint hum of distant trains. Adler waited in the shadows. His coat was buttoned to the throat, his hair disheveled, but his eyes, those steady eyes, were fixed on her with a weight she could not read. "You came," he said softly. Helena's hand tightened on the notebook. "You'd sent for me." "Yes, I had to." He stepped closer, his voice almost gentle. "Helena, it's over. The circle is finished. Look around you. Splinters, whispers, ghosts. The ministry won. The only reason you're alive is because they haven't decided what to do with you yet. Then why am I here?" Her voice was ice. He hesitated. "Because I want to save you." The words struck like a blow. He explained in a rush, as if words could wash the stain from his soul. He had made contact with the ministry not out of malice, but survival. They promised leniency, protection, if he gave them what remained of the circle. I thought it would be enough to hand over Scrap's locations, already burned names, already dead. But they want you, Helena. They want the notebook. Her blood went cold. "So you brought me here to give me to them." His face twisted, something between shame and desperation. "No, to give you a choice. If you surrender the notebook, they'll let you walk. You can leave this city, start over. No more running, no more shadows." You've carried this weight too long. The notebook burned hot against her chest. Its pages shivered beneath her hand alive. You think they'll let me live, she whispered. Adler's voice cracked. I think it's the only chance you have. Then she heard it, the scrape of boots on concrete, the metallic click of a safety catch.
Shadows shifted at the far end of the warehouse, men in dark coats stepping into the faint light. It was a trap. Helena's heart slammed against her ribs. She backed away, clutching the notebook tight. Adler reached out a hand, his face pleading. Helena, please, don't make them kill you. Give it to me. Give it to them. Her breath came sharp, ragged. She looked at him, this man who had sheltered her, hidden her, taught her how to read codes in silence. She searched his face for the truth, but all she saw was the fracture. You betrayed us, she whispered. You betrayed them. The notebook trembled. Ink scratched across its pages words, forming so fast the pen lines tore the paper, not him. Them run. Her stomach dropped. Not Adler. The betrayal was wider. The shadows advancing were not merely ministry men, they were led by one of the circle's own. The scarred woman stepped into the light cigarette between her lips, her eyes gleaming with triumph. Sabe, none of you are. Adler froze. No. The woman's smile was thin and cold. You always thought I was broken, but broken things cut deepest. She flicked ash onto the floor. I led them to you both. Munich belongs to the ministry now. Helena's pulse surged. Betrayal within betrayal. Adler had been weak, yes, but this was worse. This was deliberate venomous. Gunmetal glinted in the woman's hand. Hand it over, Helena, or watch him die. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the notebook in Helena's grip, to the voices swirling within it. Then train wheels screeched in her ears, though the yard beyond was silent. The dead were shouting now, a chorus rising, listen, move. Helena hurled the lantern from the floor, its shattered flame licking across spilled oil. Smoke erupted, filling the warehouse with chaos. Gunfire cracked. Adler lunged, shoving Helena toward the side door. Run, he shouted, his voice raw. She ran. Snow swallowed her as she burst into the night, bullets hissing past. She sprinted across the frozen yard, the notebook pressed to her chest. Behind her, shouts tangled with fire, with the roar of collapsing beams. For a moment, she thought she heard Adler cry out, but then it was gone, drowned in the storm of sound. She didn't look back. By the time she reached the far street, her lungs seared and her vision blurred, the notebook scrawled one last message across its trembling pages. The circle is broken, but you are not. Helena fell against the wall of a shuttered warehouse, sobbing the words burning into her. Adler was lost. The circle was shattered. Munich itself was closing like a fist around her, but the train still waited, and so did the dead. The reckoning. The fire in the railway warehouse smoldered for 2 days, smoke staining the sky, over Munich a bruised gray.
Official reports spoke of a gas accident, but Helena knew better. She had seen betrayal take shape in human form. The scarred woman's laugh still echoed in her ears, Adler's last cry still buried in her chest. Now alone in a city tightening like a noose, Helena clutched the notebook with both hands. The circle was gone. Every ally lost, scattered or dead, yet she could not let it end in ashes. Not while the train still whispered, not while the dead still pressed their names against her pages. The reckoning began, not with fire, but with silence. She had taken refuge in an attic above a shuttered tailor's shop. Nights bled into each other, her body weakened by hunger, her eyes haunted by the scarred woman's betrayal. But the notebook never slept. Its pages hummed faintly, trembling with a life of their own.
At times, she would wake to find new writing scrawled across the margins, fragments of names, directions, sometimes just the word listen over and over. Then one dawn, a page ripped itself clean open. Ink bled across, forming a map of Munich jagged lines, marking tunnels, train yards, a single circle near the Ostbahnhof. Beneath it, one word stood stark: tonight. Her pulse pounded. The reckoning had chosen its hour. She moved like a ghost through the city that evening, wrapped in a threadbare coat, the notebook pressed to her chest. Snow fell in thick flakes, muffling her steps. The streets near Ostbahnhof were half deserted, but patrols stalked every corner. Helena slipped through alleys following the map's crude lines until she found herself standing before an abandoned signal tower. Inside, dust thickened the air. The levers had rusted, the windows cracked. But in the center of the floor, where no human hand could have touched, lay a single sheet of paper. She picked it up with trembling fingers. It was a passenger manifest. Train 407. Her eyes blurred as she read the names, her brothers, her mother's, dozens more. Real ink, real handwriting, not the ministry's forgeries. At the bottom, fresh words had been added in jagged script: bring us to light. Behind her boots struck the floorboards.
The scarred woman stepped into the room, flanked by ministry men. Her cigarette glowed in the shadows, her smile thin and cruel. I knew the ghosts would bring you here, she said softly. They always do. Helena's breath caught. You used them. No, you did. The woman's eyes glittered. You fed them with your grief, with your obsession. They are yours as much as they are theirs. And tonight you'll feed them one last time before I silence this charade forever. She raised her pistol.
But the notebook in Helena's arms convulsed its pages, fluttering as though caught in a storm. Ink bled across in violent strokes, words tearing themselves onto the paper. Not yet. The lights shattered. Darkness swallowed the tower. Wind howled through broken panes, and then it came a roar like steel on steel, a vibration that shook the floor beneath their feet. Train wheels screamed, though no rails ran here. The men panicked. One stumbled toward the door, only to be wrenched into shadow, his cry cut off. Another fired blindly, bullets ricocheting off walls. The scarred woman's smile faltered, her pistol wavering. Through the darkness, Helena saw it, a train emerging from nowhere, spectral steel, shimmering windows glowing faintly. Faces pressed against the glass, her brother, her mother, Adler, Marek, Jan, all the lost, staring with hollow eyes. Train 407 had come. The scarred woman whispered, "What have you done?" Helena's voice was steady, though her hands shook. I listened. The ghostly train screeched to a halt inside the tower, its impossible bulk filling every inch of space, yet breaking no wall. The doors slid open, and a wind howled out, freezing, carrying with it the voices of hundreds. Reckoning, the ministry men broke, fleeing into the storm. The scarred woman fired once, twice. The bullets dissolved in the air, swallowed by the voices. She dropped her gun, her bravado crumbling as the dead advanced. Helena stepped forward, notebook in hand. Its final page burned, hot words etching themselves in fire: one must pay. The scarred woman screamed as the wind caught her, dragging her toward the waiting doors. Helena did not move. She watched as betrayal was claimed, as the woman who had sold them all, vanished into the train's dark maw. The doors slammed shut with a thunderous finality. The train shuddered, smoke rose, the voices fell silent, and then it was gone. The tower stood empty, the night eerily still. Only Helena remained trembling. The notebook's last page, now blackened, blank.
That she left Munich at dawn. She carried the manifest she had found, its ink smudged with tears and frost, and the empty notebook that had once burned with voices. On the border, she walked alone through snow, each step heavy with loss. But as the sun broke through clouds, she felt something shift, a silence, not of absence, but of peace. The passengers of train 407 had claimed their reckoning. Their whispers had faded, their demands stilled. For the first time in years, Helena's hands no longer trembled. She tucked the manifest into her coat and whispered into the cold air, "I brought you to light." And for once there was no reply. Spicy, huh? Ashes on the rails. It was the summer of 1992 when the Municipal Archive of Munich was finally open to the public. The Cold War had ended. Old vaults were being unsealed, and forgotten boxes found their way onto long wooden tables under buzzing fluorescent lights. Most were dull receipts, tax ledgers, railway schedules, yellowed into illegibility. But in box 73, misfiled between tramline records, an archivist found a notebook. Its leather cover was cracked, warped from moisture. The clasp, long broken, inside many pages had crumbled to dust, but a handful remained still legible. Under the dust-specked glass of the preservation lamps, on the first page, a name, Helena Weiss. The archivist frowned. Weiss was not an uncommon surname, but Helena had resonance. In the 1960s, rumors had circled about a woman who had spoken of a ghost train and vanished from Munich's streets without trace. Files about her had disappeared into the ministry's black drawers. Yet here, perhaps, was her hand. The handwriting was jagged, desperate. Names filled every inch, hundreds of them crammed together until the ink bled. Many were marked with crosses, others with single words, scrawled beside them, "Child brother shoemaker, last seen." On one page, the archivist noticed something stranger still. The ink did not match any known pen. Under magnification, it shimmered faintly like soot pressed into paper, and written across the center in shaky capitals, "Train 407, they are still here." News spread quickly. Historians descended on the archive, turning pages with gloved fingers. Skeptics dismissed it as trauma writing, an invention of a survivor who had lost family. Others whispered that it fit too neatly with the story. Long buried a wartime transport, gone missing a train that left Slovakia in 1945 and never arrived.
But the real shock came when another file surfaced. In 1960, the Munich police had seized documents during a raid in the Ostbahnhof district. They cataloged forged manifests, propaganda pamphlets, and one suspicious item. That item, filed and forgotten, turned out to be a single sheet of passenger names, faded brittle. Cross-referencing it against the notebook, archivists gasped. At the bottom of the sheet was a name also found in Helena's hand, Jakob Weiss. Beside it, a word written in unfamiliar script, as though burned into the page itself. Listen. Journalists flocked to the story. Tabloids printed wild claims. Ghost train confirmed Munich, haunted by wartime secrets. Scholars were more cautious, but in survivor circles, the discovery struck deeper. Families who had whispered about vanished relatives began writing letters, searching for fragments of their own names in Helena's cramped scrawl.
One woman whose grandmother had disappeared in 1945 recognized her surname repeated twice in the notebook's margins. She wept in the archive's reading room, clutching the glass case as if she might step through and find the missing. Another man, an elderly former rail worker, swore he remembered whispers among staff of a train, redirected at tunnel sealed orders no one questioned. Seeing Helena's words broke him. We thought it was rumor, he told a reporter, but she knew. The notebook was moved to climate-controlled storage. Scholars debated endlessly, was Helena a survivor, a witness, or something more? Some argued she had fabricated the voices interpreting grief as guidance. Others suggested she had been manipulated by Cold War propaganda. But one thing remained undisputed. Every name she wrote corresponded to a real person deported in the final months of the war. People who never returned, people who, on official ledgers, simply vanished. Train 407 was never located. No tracks led to its wreck. No tunnel revealed its bones. Yet in Helena's notebook, the dead spoke with a clarity the living could not ignore. Mombam Jasai Hassandi. At the end of the final preserved page, the archivist noticed faint lines almost rubbed away by time. The reckoning is done. They are quiet now, but I hear them still whenever the rails hum under my feet. If anyone finds this, know they wanted light, and I gave it. The handwriting wavered as though written with trembling hands. Beneath it, in smaller script, one last word scrawled so faintly it was nearly invisible. Listen. The notebook became known as the Weiss Journal. Some treated it as folklore, others as testimony. To the families of the lost, it was neither. It was proof not of ghosts, not of miracles, but of remembrance. Proof that one woman, broken and hunted, had carried their names through fire and betrayal and silence, refusing to let them fade. Even now, in railway museums, survivors sometimes lay flowers at the foot of her display case. They say when the night is quiet and a train passes, on the distant tracks you can feel the glass hum faintly, as though Helena's words were still alive within the paper. And if you lean close enough to the notebook, the curator's whisper, you might just hear it, the echo of 100 voices carried on the rails, whispering their only demand: bring us to light.